I'm David Hollauer, Meadowlark Extension District, and I'm standing in a brome field that's been hit, like many others across the area, with fall armyworm feeding injury this fall. You know, this has been a pest, the fall armyworm, that has become, unfortunately, a little bit of a late summer, early fall tradition for us. Fall armyworm has come in a couple of cases over the last 5 years and done to other stands just like it's done here. Lots of feeding injury, opened up the canopy to some problems. So I want to talk a little bit about what that might look like as we go through the rest of the growing season. You know, probably the best way to talk about what we might see as we look ahead is to see a little bit about what we've had coming into this and where we sit today. I guess coming into it, I would say that July was actually pretty nice from a rainfall standpoint. I guess that is unless you had hay to put up. You know, in some cases, haying was delayed because of some of the ample moisture that we had during the month of July. But for the first time in a few years, it really allowed us an opportunity to get some regrowth out there post-harvest in a timely manner, so that we kind of felt like we're getting a little bit of a chance to recover that maybe we haven't had in some of the falls of recent. We need that grass regrowth following harvest and well in advance of dormancy, so that we can have a time for that plant to recover before it goes into the fall dormancy season. We need that plant to get energy into its root system so that it'll take off and grow the next spring. And we had that during this July. In a lot of cases, pretty good regrowth on some of these stands, and pastures had held up fairly well, and that's where we sat come August. Now, what happened in August is unfortunately the same thing that's happened a couple times again as I referenced in the past 5 years, and that is the arrival of fall armyworm. You know, fall armyworm migrate in from the south on an annual basis. Sometimes we see one generation, sometimes we might see multiple. And unfortunately, this year in early August, we had a fall armyworm invasion, and really the moisture started cutting off as well. In fact, we've gone through a period where those two have coincided a little bit, and that's what's caused a problem for a lot of these stands. So even after some good regrowth, we had a lot of fall armyworm pressure. In fact, we have a pheromone trap program in the state of Kansas, and our fall armyworm traps that we have in the Meadowlark Extension District at Grantville and here in Holton, both of those had numbers that were higher than we'd really ever seen before. So we have this perfect storm. We had good regrowth that was attractive to the moth. We had a lack of moisture that kind of slowed the growth of those particular stands, and then we had a whole bunch of armyworms that came in and started feeding. And so we're going to talk through a few things and hopefully answer a few of your questions about what this fall armyworm infestation really is about and what it might look like as we go forward. One of the first questions we probably really need to answer is, what can we expect from this pest going forward? Is it going to be something that's going to come back and cause us problems, or are we done for the season? You know, there's some pests that we do have that kind of come and go with one generation. Fall armyworm may not be one of those. Again, it migrates in from the south. Its life cycle is about 30 days long. So from the beginning of feeding to the beginning of feeding is about 30 days. Now, only about 2 weeks of that is actually spent feeding, but there may be overlapping generations that cause that feeding to feel like it lasts a whole lot longer than 2 weeks. Ultimately, though, because of that 30-day beginning to beginning sort of life cycle, there's the possibility that we could have another generation this year. Now, with any luck, the moths that came out of this last generation got up and went somewhere else, and they're going to cause somebody else some problems. Or with any luck, they'll go back south before they cause us any more problems. But there is the possibility that we could see at least another generation, possibility of 2, as the season goes on. Keep in mind that those larvae are going to grow from very, very small to about 1.5 inches in length. And so we are trying to gauge, as we see those, how big are those larvae that are going to be out there, how many per square foot. Again, we're looking at 4 to 5 per square foot is kind of our threshold. But we need to understand that that life cycle is possibility going to bring them back for at least one more shot at us again this summer. And that means we need to be scouting. The second question that often comes up is, should we be doing something to mitigate it? You know, in a lot of cases, we are not seeing anything but large larvae out there, and quite frankly, that may be too far along in the life cycle to do too much with from an insecticide standpoint. You know, at least very effectively. We can sometimes slow them down a little bit. Sometimes we'll kill them. But a lot of times once we get a larva that's 1 inch or more long, we have a pretty tough time killing that with many of our insecticides. In fact, that's one of the things that we often hear. I sprayed, it didn't do any good. Well, first of all, I would challenge you to look and say, did we have smaller larvae down in the canopy? We need to make sure that as we're scouting for that we know kind of what we have down in the canopy, because in many cases we'll do a very good job against those. The second thing that I would say is, did we apply our insecticide at the right product, right time, right place, in the right manner? And by that, that simply means, did I use a product that was labeled for grass, the grass crop that I'm in, or the alfalfa crop that I'm in, whatever crop I'm in, was it labeled for that crop? That I use it at the appropriate rate? Did I use it at the appropriate time? You know, as I said, those larger larvae are difficult to control, and sometimes we worry about insecticide resistance. That is a problem. It can be a big issue for us, and as many applications as we're sometimes making, it would seem hard to believe that we're not maybe getting some resistance. But we need to make sure that we're doing some level of resistance management, and doing part of that is by making sure that we put on an appropriate rate of the product and an appropriate gallonage of carrier. We need to make sure that we're getting plenty of water out there as we apply that, and again, that we're doing it in an appropriate time frame, that we're trying to get after those really, really small larvae instead of waiting until something's too long to maybe control anyway. Those larvae are going to do a lot of damage in their last few days, and in many cases, we want to get out there, we want to kill them, even if we just want to take a little bit of revenge on them. We want to take care of them, but we also want to make sure that we're being careful about, you know, insect resistance management protocols. One thing I would say that is, if you end up having to spray a stand for the second time, or if you're at all worried about insect resistance, I would certainly consider another mode of action. There are other active ingredients out there that you can use that maybe give you the possibility to mix things up just a little bit. That is never a bad side from a pesticide resistance management standpoint, to make sure that you're doing that. A couple of cautions. One, make sure that you read and follow that label direction to be sure that the crop that you are applying to is done in an appropriate manner. You know, some labels have pre-harvest intervals on them. In fact, all of them will have some level of pre-harvest interval, but those may range from 0 days up to 7 days to 14 days to 30 days. It's difficult to say. You need to make sure that you read that label for sure, and make sure that the rate that you're applying is not only within label range, but that you are following an appropriate pre-harvest interval for that. If you have livestock out on a farm, you have to be very, very, very careful about that. You know, we're hearing some isolated reports of maybe some, at the very least, irritation, if not injury, to animals that have, you know, been in pastures that have been sprayed. And so be sure that you're being cognizant of that. Make sure that you're paying attention to what that label says, and adding, you know, certainly a degree of caution in there as the case may be. We also need to make sure that for our protection that we are following re-entry intervals. In many cases, it's pretty tempting to go out there the day after we spray, get back in there, dig around on the ground, dig around in that foliage, trying to find those dead worms. You know, we want to make sure that we kill them. Make sure that you're following that re-entry interval. You know, we hear as well of, you know, maybe getting some eye irritation or even illness, skin irritation, because we're out there too quickly and we have not followed that re-entry interval. So make sure, again, read and follow that product label. They're in place for our protection. Sometimes we get pretty agitated at, you know, the restrictions that they put on us, but they are there for a reason. And if we're going to keep those products in our arsenal, we need to make sure that we're following that label as well. I talked just a little bit about some of the applications when there's an animal out there, but what about utilizing these forages going forward? Again, as long as we're following those pre-harvest intervals, we can do that. But one of the things from the grass growth and development side is just to be understanding of what that grass plant is going through. You know, if you look at this stand behind me and you see how short that grass is, you know, there's some grass around it, but animals are going to graze here, they're going to graze there, they're going to graze in all these different places. We have to be sure that we're giving grass an ample time to recover. And so, you know, whether that be on the grazing side and we're making sure that we're, you know, not going back in there too quickly or grazing too heavily, or whether it be maybe in the case of alfalfa or a hay stand where we, you know, we're thinking about maybe taking another cutting. Have to be very careful about this situation. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but we need to give that grass ample time to recover as it gets ready to go into dormancy if we're going to maintain that stand the way that we want to. Many of our stands, unfortunately, have weeds. This one behind me has them as well. You can see both grass and broadleaf weeds out there, unfortunately. That is something that we are probably going to have to expect a little bit more of in some of these stands that have been pretty severely injured. You know, this is just an opening in the stand. So you take a cool season grass like brome, for instance, and you put it during a stressful time period, you go ahead and graze it all off, or you fed it with armyworms and you got rid of it completely. That's an opening for a broadleaf weed or a grass plant, a summer grass plant, to sort of come in and get started. You know, that's where plants like broomsedge or foxtail or, you know, purple top, some of those start in some of these stands as well. So we need to be aware that some of those are likely to be on the increase. That doesn't mean that they're going to become problematic, but it does mean that we need to be vigilant about that. Now, in some cases, you know, the temptation might be, well, I took care of the armyworms and now I'm going to get out there and I'm going to take care of those weeds. Understand as well that labels often have on them some restrictions as it pertains to when we can spray that grass plant out there. So we need to be making sure that we're following those as well. We certainly don't want to do undue injury to a plant that's already under stress. So just making sure that we understand that label is pretty important as we maybe are planning some weed control operations. It may mean that we have to wait a little bit, but we are probably going to expect a greater increase in weed pressure in some of these stands as we move forward, because they've not only been hayed once, but now they've been fed on by armyworms and removed again, with the potential that we would see more damage even this fall. You might be interested in something else that you can do to kind of spur things along, and in many cases, especially with cool season grasses or alfalfa stands, that often goes to soil fertility. You know, we have a lot of stands that are not great from the standpoint of our soil fertility management. We've got a lot of potassium levels that are low. We've had phosphorus levels that have been low for decades. And unfortunately, that has probably contributed to how some of these stands respond after harvest. But it might be an opportunity now to help spur some of these stands along a little bit with maybe a little bit of a nitrogen and phosphorus. Those are the two nutrients that really, going into the fall season from a recovery standpoint, that might help us out a little bit. And oftentimes that will help with tillering of that grass plant. We might get more plants out there, kind of help thicken that stand up a little bit, give it some survivability going into winter that we really do need to enhance if we can. Again, may not be one of those things that's in the cards for you, but one of those things, if you want to give it a shot, a fertility program, especially with nitrogen and phosphorus, might be one of those things to consider. Where do we go from here? I think the first thing is that we probably need to keep scouting. You know, it's been in some cases 2, 3, maybe even pushing 4 weeks since we saw that first infestation. And if that's the case, knowing that we have an insect pest with a 30-day kind of life cycle, give or take, there's a potential that that next hatch could be coming out and we could start to be seeing some feeding again. So we need to make sure that we're scouting on a pretty regular basis. You know, my suggestion would be probably every 3, 4, 5 days, if at all possible. And that doesn't mean just getting out of the truck and looking around and getting back in and going. You know, in many cases, as you scout, you'll find drastically different levels as you go across the stand. And so to be on top of those, make sure that you're scouting those fields fairly vigorously and not just hitting 1 or 2 spots, but hitting a number of spots so that you can get a good idea as to what's actually going on out there. That's the first thing. Keep scouting, making sure that you're staying ahead of them. That way, if you do have to do something, you can get them while they're small and you can prevent as much damage as possible, especially as we get closer and closer to fall dormancy. That's going to be an issue. That's really the second thing to keep in mind. You know, the way that a grass plant grows is it is taking energy from a root system to send up new shoots in the spring. We need to get enough new shoots, a tall enough plant, enough biomass out there that photosynthesis is occurring on its own, and it's building top growth and it's building root growth. As we get ready to go into the fall, we're trying to do the same thing all over again. We already cut it off from a hanging standpoint in many situations, and we've asked it to regrow from that root system. And now we've mowed it off again with a fall armyworm. That's a lot of stress to put on that plant. And so we need to kind of be thinking as we go through fall, how is that stand faring in regard to recovery as we go through the season? You know, I think it's difficult to say at this early stage whether that stand is gone or not. You know, we can look across this stand right here. There's green out there. There's not a lot. It is definitely under stress. It is likely that we'll see some reduced production in this stand next year because it has been hammered so many times in such a short time frame. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to survive completely. As we talked about earlier, there's probably going to be some weed pressure. It's probably going to green up slower. But right now, there's no reason to believe that that stand is gone. Now, if this continues to occur over multiple times this fall, we can put enough stress on a stand that sometimes we can see injury. Some of you have seen that before, where a stand is really thinned out to the point of everything else taking over because of that. That's why we want to make sure that we're scouting and kind of understand what that grass growth and development process is as we go into the fall. It'd be really great if we get some moisture, some cooler temperatures, and a window this fall for that grass to go ahead and recover. A perennial grass plant like brome or even a well-established alfalfa stand really has a lot of power in that root system and the ability of that plant to recover after some disaster like this. But they maybe can't keep doing it forever. We just need to make sure that we're on top of it. That's some of the art and the science of grazing, is trying to get a feel for what is that stand doing as I go into the fall, so I can start to think about what I maybe need to think about next spring. You might still have a lot of questions. We've got a lot of questions about what's going to happen as well. Weather is a big factor right now that is going to come in and affect many of these stands. But if you want to discuss your particular stand a little bit more, every one of them is going to be a little bit different. You know, no two stands are going to respond the same, but there are some basic kind of principles that we can apply. Hopefully this video has provided you with a few of those, but if you want to discuss your stand some more, be glad to visit with you more. You can reach us at any of our Meadowlark Extension District offices. My email address is dhallau@ksu.edu, if that helps you out. And along the way, we've got a lot of other great people that are discussing around this problem as well. So we'd be happy to get together with you, talk about what that might mean for your stand, and try to help you as you make decisions going forward.